Okay, so I'm John Cooper and I work at Los Angeles Biomedical Research Institute and the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. So what our lab is doing is working on two fronts. We're trying to understand how the disease affects the brain, and we're trying to come up with ways that once we understand that, how we can use that information to guide where to deliver therapies and whether those therapies have been effective. So the overall theme of this is that the brain is not affected the same way. Different parts of the brain are affected in different ways to different extents. Some cell populations in the brain are more vulnerable than others. And it's also turning out that some cell types within the brain are going to be more important than other cell types to how the disease progresses and will actually contribute to that disease process to different extents. And the thing that then makes it more complicated again is that each of these diseases is actually quite different. And I know that they're grouped together because they share certain common features. They do broadly have similar things that happen, but exactly how they happen and the way it gets there is actually very different. And we've seen that, for example, most clearly in looking at a group of cells which have been largely overlooked in the brain. And we largely think of the neurons, so those electrically active cells in the brain, as being the primary focus of the disease, but we're actually looking at, in some ways, the supporting cast. So there's other cells within the brain, astrocytes and microglia. The astrocytes we can think of as being the cells' environmental watchdogs. They're controlling the environment around the neurons to make sure that it's conducive so they can work that to their best. And we've found that in multiple forms of the disease now that those are actually the key cells that really have problems. And because they can't do their jobs properly, that has a knock-on effect upon the brain cells, upon the neurons, and that's what kind of continues that sort of cycle of degeneration. But it's the astrocytes and the microglia, which are the brain's immune system, that are actually key players in that process. But how it happens and how it goes wrong is actually quite different in different forms of the disease. So we've looked in the three main forms of the disease, CLN1, 2 and 3, and we find that there are problems with glia in both CLN1 and CLN3, but the problems that they have are different problems. Nevertheless, the end result is that they can still damage neurons and cause problems for them. CLN2 is turning out to be the odd one out, in that they don't seem to be the problems with those glial cells. They seem to be able to respond perfectly happily and do what they need to do, but the problems actually seem to originate within the neurons. So what we've got is three different diseases. They're caused by mistakes in different genes, so it's not necessarily a surprise that different things are happening, but they are happening in a very radically different way at the cellular level. Now, the other thing that I talked about here was a new discovery that we had, and it's really important for therapy, is that if you're going to have the greatest chances of treating something successfully, you need to deliver that therapy to where the problems are taking place. And one of the new discoveries we've made is that the spinal cord is really important in these diseases. And we have to be honest, we completely overlooked it. We tended to think of the spinal cord as being the dangly bit off the back of the brain, which it is, but it actually is a really important structure, obviously for function within the body, and surprisingly, it's affected remarkably early in these diseases. And what we see is that we see pathology, we see effects that are going on, massive amounts of cell loss and inflammation are taking place in the spinal cord really early in the disease process, before the problems then happen up in the brain. And what we're thinking is actually taking place is that the disease may be tracking along interconnected pathways within the brain. It may be down to transport, it might be to those synapses, the little gaps that the cells talk to each other, but clearly the disease is spreading along. Now, most importantly, rather than just finding those problems, the key thing is they actually contribute to the disease, because working together with Mark Sands at WashU, we're actually now delivering therapy to those sites and having positive effects. So we're really moving forwards quite well on several fronts.